Chris, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for dropping by. I love this.
I just walked in, and the first thing that my eyes instantly go to, the nailer. So is this a Canadian thing? What's going on here? David has one. You have one. Tell me the story.
Okay, so I don't think it's a Canadian thing, and this is like complete speculation because I should probably nail down the actual story. When I went to LA in 2002, 2003, whenever I went down to LA to work with Scott Humphrey at the Chop Shop, I might have told this story again, so if you guys already know it, whatever, I'll tell it again. They had, him and his engineer there, Frank Greiner, had an amazing setup, and they had this like, now it's a dime a dozen. Like you walk into every studio and everybody's got this thing. Nobody had these like multi-amp racks and like that wasn't a common thing. And they had this rack that like suspended on cables from the ceiling, and all the heads were, all the guts were, chassis were taken out of the cabs, and it looked like a fucking sci-fi movie. It was awesome. And so they had, I think, 5 amps that were like the in-house studio amps. The Nailer was one of them. I'd never even heard of the name, and I was kind of like, not a guitar nerd, but like I liked digging into guitar amps and shit like that as much as you could in, the late 90s where it was all magazines, right? But I think they may have heard about it or gotten introduced to it through, again, speculating, possibly Billy Howerdale. I know Scott and Billy were working on something at the time, and I know Billy was a big fan of that amp very early on. And I think the Friedman Naked was basically a higher wattage power amp. It was like a 100-watt Marshall power amp with that thing. Like it was like a Frankenstein. I think Billy loved that amp, but just wanted something with more headroom and more power. And I think that's the story behind the Naked amp. The other person that I know Scott Humphrey worked a lot with that would have used these on a lot of records was Rob Cavallo. Rob Cavallo, I think, used Tim Pierce as like one of his main call session guys. This is all speculation. I'm putting pieces together here. So if I got any shit wrong, I'm sure you guys will all let me know about it. And so this was an amp that Tim Pierce, this was kind of like, I'm walking out the door going to a session. What head am I taking? I think that was one of his things for a long time, kind of early on when nobody knew what that thing was. So how I came to use it was at the Chop Shop. So Scott and Frank had one there. Billy Howerdale used them. Tim Pierce, and I'm assuming Rob Cavallo probably had one as well. I didn't know of a single soul who had another one. I found out later that David Bendeth used them.
Rob Cavallo does have one.
Oh, there you go. So pretty much anybody who has used those extensively in the studio pretty much bought one. And so when I stopped working at the Chop Shop, I helped Tommy Lee build his studio that he's now moved on from called the Atrium, which was in Calabasas. And because the Chop Shop is closing down, he basically took like all the gear from the Chop Shop. So Tommy has the Nailer from the Chop Shop, and then couple years after, I'm like, now I gotta get one. Once I wasn't working at the Atrium anymore, because that was my home base for a while. Then I'm like, I gotta get one. So the Diesel, the exact same story. So the Diesel was in that same thing. So they had at the Chop Shop, it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was a Diesel VH4, the Nailer Super Drive. There was a Marshall, a 50-watt Jubilee. I don't think they were called the Jubilees. It was one of the gold ones. 2550, I think, was the model number, which is basically like the 50-watt version of the Jubilee, and a triple rectifier that we used to slave to a VHT 2150 power amp. So, although it was like trying to get all the best stuff of the rectifier and then try to fix some of the stuff that gets a little flubby with it, and that was an awesome sound. That obviously I don't have that here, but a lot of what we had at the Chop Shop was just like, it was the perfect curated studio amp arsenal that like Scott and Frank had already kind of figured out what the good shit was. They had a matchless DC-30, which I've got a matchless there it is a DC-30, but I took the chassis out and put it in the head. And then there's some other shit that I Mark IV, that's obviously like fucking awesome. And the VHT Pitbull, which was something that I know also I didn't realize, I think Bendeth uses that as well, right?
I don't know David for using the Pitbull, but I definitely know him for using the VH4. And I'm a big fan of the Pitbull. They are awesome.
Yeah. I used them on a few sessions that were I didn't know of a studio that had one, but I worked with a couple guitar players that brought them in, and I was just like, man, it was one of those things that like every time I used a pit bull, it was a guitar player who brought one in, and I think at the time I probably wasn't very good at separating like the player from the gear, because I'm like, dude, you sound great. And it was like, they sounded great. And then sometimes when I play through that thing, it's just fucking, I'm not a great guitar player, but sometimes when I play through that thing or have maybe players that aren't quite as proficient, it's a little harder to get to coax some good sounds out of it. It's an unforgiving amp, but when it works, it's fucking awesome.
Yeah.
Really awesome.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. Very unforgiving, but if you can play, like I don't sound great through a pit bull, but
I don't either.
You know, the people I've recorded that have played them, you know, they have them dialed in, and that's what I think is really cool about that amp, the way that it's set up with the 5-band EQ, a lot like the Mesas. You know, people can find their own sound, and it works for them or it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing is that amp, like both the regular EQ and the graphic EQ, is so almost like counterintuitive. Like the only time I'd ever seen a graphic EQ on an amp was a Mark. So the first thing I did on that thing was did the thing you do with the Mark, and that does not work.
Nope.
And even like the regular EQ, if you treat that kind of like more like a Marshall, where you can turn the knob like 70%, you're like, I think I heard it do something. Like that doesn't work with that either. It's like that's subtle. Like small movements make a big thing on that amp, which makes it very versatile, because you can plug a guitar in that doesn't have any low end, and you're not like, oh, this amp's not going to really work. It's like, no, you can make that work, or vice versa, and whatever. Yeah, it's a pretty awesome amp. I think a lot of people write it off because it's just so in depth.
Absolutely.
And you have to tweak it. And I think that's why the players who own them and they sound amazing, like they've spent so much time with that thing, they've found all the sweet spots and the magic.
Yeah. So before we move forward, I could talk about guitar amps all day. Yes. But this Scott Humphrey triple rectifier, was it a 2-channel or was it a 3-channel?
It was a 3-channel.
It was a 3-channel. Yeah. Okay, that's
this was before the days of like everybody worrying about which revision and this and that and the other. Nobody cared. It was kind of like, okay, well,
it's a rectifier.
Yeah, if this one's a little flubbier than the others, well, then you figure out a way to dial it back. And if this one doesn't have as much gain, well, then you just turn the gain up a little bit. Like, I don't ever remembering that being a thing until maybe like the last 5 or 10 years. In the early 2000s, at least my experience was, and maybe it's just because like the information wasn't out there. There wasn't. The preciousness over all the individual models and components and stuff like that weren't that big of a deal.
I mean, if we're on that subject of everything, what I actually remember being a young guitar player is that everybody was much more interested in having 3-channel dual rectifiers than 2-channel dual rectifiers, because it gave you the extra channel for channel switching live. Yeah. So like I remember that Korn and Limp Bizkit and Blink-182, everybody went to the new models. Yeah. And, I actually had an old 2-channel dual rectifier, and I wanted a 3-channel dual rectifier because that's what everybody was doing. Yeah. Now, I mean, it's neither here nor there. Really, the big thing that we're talking about, though, is Scott Humphreys, and how he impacted your life. And I'd like to tell that story to the internet.
It was crazy. To kind of start the story, to set it up of how crazy it was for me, I have to kind of explain a little bit of like how I actually went to work with him.
Well, and I think that, for the people at home, tell them who he is.
I mean, he's a very successful producer and writer. You guys probably know him from probably the thing that he's probably most well known for is Rob Zombie's first 3 solo records, the one Dragula, which he was a writer on as well. But before him producing, he was like a pioneer of digital editing, for lack of a better term. Like he was on the forefront of like synths and samplers, like in early 80s. He's Canadian, which is one of the reasons kind of how I ended up working with him. He liked hiring Canadians. He was a keyboard player and was always on like the cutting edge of technology. So he would get hired for sessions because he had synths that only one person in Canada. He was the only guy to have this, synth in Canada. So he was very much on that and got into computers, audio computers very early on, And again, like this is kind of third person telling stories of stories that I've heard. Obviously, I got a lot of stuff directly from him, but obviously people have told me stories about Scott back in the day that, things that he was doing with, it wasn't even Pro Tools, but like doing like crazy editing
for sound tools.
Yeah, in like the early 90s, late 80s.
I heard that Scott Humphreys is responsible for Beat Detective and Strip Silence and all of those editing tools that we utilize inside of Pro Tools.
Those were basically like, I think, again, from what I've heard and trying to remember, because it's been 20 years probably since I've worked with them, but and he wasn't one to be like, yeah, I invented that. Like, he was relatively humble. Like, I would find out like years later of something that he did that I had no idea about, that he never mentioned over the course of like 4 or 5 years of working with him. But yeah, from what I've heard, like Beat Detective was like, now we have macros. Beat Detective is it is a macro of how he was already doing things, just it was being done very manually.
Yeah, like he was going and making those cuts, and then he showed them like, hey, if I could identify all of them.
Correct. He's like, I can do this with my eye. Like, I can go and see the waveform. Can you write something that automatically puts an edit at all those waveforms? And then there's like, cool, awesome. Once I've identified those, we cut them. Okay, cool. Can we do that? And then we move them onto the grid or move them wherever we want to go. Can we do that? Okay, and then once that's done, can we fade it all? And so that was like, it was basically a macro now that we can make our own, like with like sound flow and stuff like that. But that was a huge thing. The one that I remember hearing about was, now we take it so for granted, is batch crossfades. So, and I remember when I first started, like really started like playing around with digital audio, batch crossfades may have existed. I'm trying to remember if it did. I think it did, but fades used to take forever. Like, it would literally be like writing an audio file to the hard drive. And the hard drives were fast, but the whole system was slow. So when you'd write a fade, you'd pick your edit, you'd fade it, and then you'd have to wait.
Yeah, and for everybody at home, what most people don't know is that when Pro Tools was first invented, it truly was slow tools.
Slow tools.
And what he means by that is, say you had a stereo bounce of that track and you wanted to put a fade at the end of that stereo bounce, that's actually 2 fades, one for left and one for right.
Yes.
And for each one of those fades to render, it would typically be somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes per side. So if you needed to, render a stereo fade out, you could be looking at a 15-20 minutes for a fade to actually render, and then you'd listen to it and be like, oh, the fade's too short.
Yeah.
And undo it and do it again.
Well, when I started editing, like really like in a professional studio, when I started editing in Pro Tools, if you would edit a drum track, and I mean, now when I record drums, like sometimes I'm up to like 30 inputs. Back then, people were still like doing sane stuff, 16 inputs, right? So let's say you have 16 tracks of drums. Once you were done all your editing, if you wanted to fade, and batch crossfade existed, so you'd select everything and hit fade. That used to take hours. Like, you would let that run overnight because it was every fade, and you would see it. It would just go, it would be like one at a time. Like, now it's all real time, like, it just happens, right? But back then it didn't. So before batch crossfading, and again, we're bitching and complaining that it takes all night. Before batch crossfade existed, you had to go select each individual thing, highlight it, make a fade, wait. Move to the next, highlight it, make a fade, wait. Make a fade, wait. So again, the thing that I was told was that Scott was like, I'm doing the same fade to every single thing. Can we select the whole thing and apply the same fade to everything automatically? And that was what we now know is like just batch crossfading. I mean, I don't even think they call it batch crossfading because it's just so synonymous with the way we work. But even that was like, something we take for granted, that was something that he was doing, and I think collaborating closely. I heard stories, he told me stories of like, he would come up with an idea, like I'm sure you probably deal with this with some of the plugin stuff when you're developing a plugin, but back then when you think about an idea you have for Pro Tools, you're like, oh, I wish Pro Tools could do this. Well, when he wished Pro Tools could do that, he would call, there was like 2 coders at back then it was DigiDesign, he would call them, and say, hey, I got this idea. Can you do something like this? And they'd be like, yeah, that's a great idea. Give us a week. And they would write the code and come and either FedEx a floppy disk to him with a new installer, and he'd install it. And now that feature would be there. So I heard a bunch of stories of stuff like that where, he would request certain things, and it would a week later it was part of the thing. But he was like one of 10 guys probably doing that, just doing digital editing in, on a computer. Like, he was super early to it.
Yeah, but I mean, that's really how this industry was built. Everybody thinks that this industry, is an old industry, but I think it's a very young industry, really. And the way that we've been doing it truly is
the workflows. I mean, I consider myself a little bit of a dinosaur. A lot of my workflows are still kind of replicating the old analog thing in the digital world, and it is actually very limiting, which can sometimes be a bad thing, but can also sometimes be a good thing. But yeah, like I see some of the younger guys doing things that they don't have. I call it scar tissue. They don't have the scar tissue of like working, having to deal with a patch bay or a console with only 5 aux sends and, tape machine with only 24 inputs. Like they don't know any better, and they're doing stuff. And I'm like, holy shit, like you don't have the scar tissue of that old way. And it makes you realize, like a lot of the everyday things that we do are not, I mean, yes, they are kind of tied to, the early days of the Beatles, like, yeah, but not a lot. It's gone so far from that, yeah, it's relatively young. I mean, even if you go back to like, Les Paul and the multi-track recorder, that's not that long ago.
No. When you compare it to industries that are, what I would still consider young, like something like carpentry, that's an ancient industry.
Yeah.
Something like automotive, that's a young industry, but it's still almost
probably twice as old as recording music.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just very interesting to see how things have progressed and to see how these steps have been taken. And, Scott Humphreys has been an interest of mine because, he's a credit that if you look deep enough, you're going to find on the Black Album of Metallica,
Yes.
And that's where a lot of these tools, as far as my understanding came from, were developed, was during the time period then when he was working on, that was one of the first times that Pro Tools was used in a very, very professional, and it was sound tools, but it was used to tune the vocal. It was used to do a lot of stuff. And, that was Scott who was instrumental in getting that stuff.
It's what, 1990, 1989, 90, something like that?
Yeah, from my understanding.
Yeah.
So, when I mean, this isn't the first time for the people at home it is, but this isn't the first time that I've sat down and geeked out about Scott Humphreys with you,
Yeah.
Because I think that that's very, very interesting. But, he also was instrumental in your career. So, tell us about working at the Chop Shop, getting in there.
Huge. Yeah, it was awesome. I mean, I worked with Scott for, like I said, I took over for Frank Greiner, who was an awesome engineer, and they did amazing work together. And I think the thing that was like instantly apparent to me was like they were so ahead of the curve with like workflow optimizing tools. And again, the way that he was ahead of his time on like the digital editing stuff, he was also ahead of his time with the studio setup. Like one of the things, again, now is commonplace, and back then, like you wouldn't see really a lot of people doing it, was like he had everything always set up. And so I was still used to the kind of the old set up, tear down. Okay, we done drums? Okay, well, we need those mics to now go and record guitars. Okay, we done guitars? Okay, we need to get those mic pre's for the vocal. And okay, we're now done. We're recording. Now we're going to go mix. His whole philosophy was everything stays set up. And I remember records, like he did a lot of work with Tommy Lee, and he did a Motley Crue record, and him and Tommy Lee were really good buddies. And so we would do all the like the Methods of Mayhem stuff and the Tommy Lee solo albums. And I remember, because Tommy liked to work this way, Tommy would go play drums when the song was kind of ready to be cut. But those were almost like placeholders. That was so we could go record the rest of the record. And then we would almost mix the thing. And then Tommy would be like, okay, let me go play the drums. And because we had mixed the whole thing, but left all the drums set up, all the EQs were the same, all the compressors were the same. If we needed an 1176 for the lead vocal, but it was on the room mic, we would buy another 1176. And that one didn't move, and that one didn't move. And like, so we would go punch drum fills, or we would go punch a different verse beat for a song.
And they just go in perfect.
They would go in perfect. And then we'd just keep mixing. It's like, well, you'd stop and you'd edit and you would put the samples in, and like, which again is not nearly as fast as it is now, but like you would take a couple hours and do that. But you're like, how are we're mixing and recording drums at the same time? Like it was a little bit of like, holy shit, like this is crazy.
Especially for, what year would that have been? 2003, 2004?
Yeah. Like, I think I went down in 2003.
Okay.
Yeah. But they'd already been doing this for years. Yep. So like their setup was crazy. They had that was the other thing that was, okay, so really quickly to backtrack without getting too deep in the weeds.
No, good enough.
I worked for, I started, like my first real studio gig was working for an engineer in Toronto. His name's Lenny DeRose. I think last time we were together with David Bendeth, we had a lot of reminiscing. They were kind of all came up through that phase one days. But Lenny's just a legendary Canadian engineer, just worked with so many amazing artists and other producers and engineers. I worked for Lenny. Lenny was friends with Scott. They had worked together on a bunch of stuff. I didn't really know. I knew who Scott was because I was a big Motley Crue fan. I loved a lot of the Rob Zombie stuff, kind of like the late 90s, early 2000s, kind of almost like industrial rock kind of stuff. Scott was like big into that. And so I knew who Scott was. I didn't know that Lenny had worked with him. And somebody had told me, they're like, oh, Lenny's recorded a Motley Crue record. I'm like, what? Had no idea. Like, again, Googling everything, right? And so he's like, yeah. And he told me which record he did. And then I'm like, oh my God. And then we started talking about it. He's like, oh yeah, you know who Scott Humphrey is? Oh yeah, absolutely. He produced all these records that I love. And I love the Black Album. So I'd seen Scott in the Black Album, the movie of the making. He's the keyboard guy. Like, yeah. So I, put all those pieces together. Anyway, so then I knew that Lenny knew him, and they still kept in touch, and whatever. I'd worked for Lenny for a little over a year, maybe a year and a half, and one day Lenny came in. I was cleaning up from a session, and he came in and he goes, I need you to go to LA on, this is like a Tuesday. He's like, I need you to go to LA on Friday. And I thought it was like for like a Sony thing. I'm like, why would I go to LA? I was like an assistant engineer. I'm like, why are they sending me to LA? And then he's like, Scott needs an engineer for a project. And I was like, holy shit, like this, I knew that, they were tight, but Scott had called looking for guys, and Lenny's like, Chris is your guy. And within 2 days of like notice, he's like, here's Scott's number, call him, book a flight, like get down there. And so within like 2 days notice, I was in LA, and I'm like, I'll be back in a couple months. And everybody's like, you're not coming back. And so I went down for one project. He had a Euphonic CS console, which anybody who's used those, they don't operate like a traditional console, and I already wasn't like super comfortable on, like I'd been working in the studio for a couple of years, so I knew it, but like I maybe engineered one session on my own. Like most of my stuff was assisting and helping out other guys, and so in like a weekend I had to learn this CS console and figure it out. And like, luckily Frank was there. So after a couple of days of fucking around and fumbling around, Frank came in and was like, okay, no, here's how you do it. And he helped get me going on that. We eventually got an SSL 4000, which was also like life-changing for me because that was the board that all my favorite records were made on. I never worked on one up until that point. But yeah, so I went down and made a record with Scott. And then after that, it was like Rob Zombie was coming in we were doing like a greatest hits thing. So we did like 3-4 new songs, and Scott's like, he's like, this is working out. You want to stay for that? I was like, yep. And then it was kind of like, all right, this is working. You're here now.
So when you got that SSL, were you the main engineer though?
Yeah.
Okay. So did you teach yourself the SSL then?
Pretty much. Yeah. And that was,
Spent some hours with that manual, huh?
Yeah, sure did.
I love when it tells you to take a break.
Yes, it sure does. Well, and also, George Horton from SSL, like he was commissioning at the time, and so he was a big help. I remember him spending a couple days with me, and I would call him for stuff. He was awesome. I filmed the video that I never actually put out. This was like the first thing I was going to be like my first YouTube video, and I got really self-conscious and never put it out. Tommy got that board when the Chop Shop went down.
The one for the atrium?
Yeah.
Is that the same Chop Shop board?
Yes.
It is?
Yeah, and Tommy sold it.
Did that desk have the Bluestone mod on it?
What's the Bluestone mod?
Where the sends could send to the buses?
No, that didn't. It had split send, so the left side would send to one and the right side would send to another, and then you pop the button out in the middle section, and it all send to the same one.
Yeah.
But I remember, distinctly remember having the conversation with Scott one day, and this was so awesome. Like one of the things I'll always remember really fondly working with Scott was like he was always open to like making things better, and like if you've got an idea, like good ideas are good ideas, like whatever. And I remember one day we were sitting around, probably like I'd only been there for maybe like 3 or 4 months. And we started talking about consoles, and I'm like, have you ever considered getting an SSL? And he's like, yeah, actually, I thought about it, but like, the CS has instant recall, and it's all this stuff, blah 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 blah. And we started talking about it, and literally over that conversation, he's like, yeah, if you could find a good one, I'd be open to swapping this thing out. And I was like, oh, this is my chance, right? And I went and found this SSL that had been in its original crate for 5 years. It was 64, left-hand patch bay, all 242 EQs.
Yep.
So Scott, having worked a bunch in Vancouver with Bob Rock, he's like, call Ron Obvious at the warehouse and ask him what we should be looking for. Like he'll spec it out for you. And I went down, he talked to him, and he's like giving me he's like, you're gonna want this, don't get this, make sure it doesn't have this. We were looking for like an old E that had been like upgraded to a G or something like that. And so I spent probably 3 or 4 days calling everybody who may have one and letting them know, being like, hey, if one comes up, let us know, blah, blah, blah. And I never thought to call SSL. And I can't remember who suggested it. Like, have you called SSL? And I'm like, no, we don't want to. We're looking for like, I think they'd even stopped making the 4000s. I'm like, no, we want a 4000. We don't want a 9. And they're like, no, just here, call. I can't remember who the sales guy was. Might have been Rick. Can't remember. But he's like, call them and see what they have, or maybe they know of somebody who's going to be getting a 9000 that's going to be getting rid of a 4. And I called them and I said, yeah, well, here's the situation. If you know anybody, he's like, I think we might have one. And I'm like, you guys have one? And he's like, yeah, a new one. And I'm like, a new one? You guys haven't made these in like 5 years or something. He's like, no, it was ordered, and then by the time the studio was finished being built, the 9K or the J's were out, and so the guy who bought the console just swapped it and took a J instead, paid the difference, and now we have this 4K that's been sitting in its original crates for 5 years. And he's like, and I'm like, do you know any of the specs on it? And he's like, no, I can find out though. And so he started reading the specs to me, and I was like going down the list that Ron had told me. It was like, check. If we had designed this board like from scratch, it was that thing. Like we needed a left-hand patch bay, we needed this, we needed that. It was like perfect. So this thing showed up, it was brand new. And George from SSL, we referred to it as the time machine because it was like, it was a brand new board, but 5 years after they like stopped making them or whatever. So anyways, that was for me, like when I got on that console, like everything did, like when I turned a high frequency, like what I wanted in my head, that thing did. When I turned the channel compressors on, I'm like, the sound I hear in my head, I want to achieve that. When I would turn the knob, it would happen. Whereas everything else was kind of like, that's not quite there. I got to keep like that SSL 4000 was like, I mean, no surprise. All my favorite records, all my favorite producers, all my favorite mixers, that's what they used. So that sound was just so like familiar and baked into me. So yeah, that was awesome for Scott to be open to actually, like he had this setup that had been working for years. And he was like, yeah, fuck yeah, go find an SSL. I'll consider it. But yeah, working with Scott was awesome. I mean, everything was optimized. Everything had to be quick, had to be easy. He was very much about efficiency and everything being like top quality. He didn't skimp on anything.
So did that whole efficient workflow the whole setup seems really, is that something that you took with you and then went and built out for Tommy over at the Atrium?
The chop shop was like the model, and that's why we bought all the gear. It was kind of like, okay, we this all works really fucking good. So you're building a studio, and we even built, like, the studio was kind of designed in the same way, where we had ISO booths specifically for the guitar cabinets. We had an ISO booth specifically for the bass cabinet. We had a small live room for guitar combos and vocals. We had a big live room for drums. Outboard gear overload, not because it was all used at the same time, but so you wouldn't have to unpatch the Pultec on the, this to get it to that. Like, so it was set up, all the amps were there, the cabinets were there, all the mics were always on the cabinet. So that was kind of back in the days of Amp Farm. And I used to joke like this is real life Amp Farm, because you would turn all the amps on. We had the Little Labs splitters going off to everything. So you'd plug one guitar in, and all the amps the cabinets would have multi-mics on them. Everything was always phase aligned, and everything sounded good, and you could literally just pop open channels on the SSL and be like, here's the diesel, 57, 421, nope, okay, let's hear the rectifier, and then let's mix and match those, and it was just always ready to go. It was as fast. It was probably faster than a plugin, because everything was there ready to go, and you didn't have to open up plugins, and it was awesome. So we basically kind of recreated that, and then improved on a few things where we could. But that was already, I think, one of the reasons why I was so excited about that whole thing, and why I, even thinking back and talking about this, which I haven't actually thought about in a while, like, just gets me so excited, was like, that's kind of the way my brain already worked. So it's hard to find people that are like on board with the stuff that, like, if you want to be like, hey, can we get some other mics because this would make my life easier? It's like, absolutely.
Well, and also, not only does it seem like Scott was open and willing to listen to your ideas and your thoughts on the situation that you found yourself in with making records with him every day, but also seemed like you guys were both working towards this system. And back then, that was before where we are with sharing knowledge on the internet. So I'm assuming that the system felt proprietary. It felt like something that you guys, cool that you were doing, that everybody else that probably came in contact with it saw it and was like, that's fucking neat, and you helped make that better, so.
Yeah, I definitely can't take credit for the setup, because that was Scott and Frank, and I'm sure Scott worked with Bob Rock for a long time, and it's like,
and
Randy, and so I'm sure that some of it was pulled from there, and seeing what works and what doesn't work. But I definitely, even to this day, it's like, it's hard to just be like, yeah, this is good. You're always trying to think of ways like, how can we make it a little bit better? And he was open to that, because that's kind of, what he had been doing for probably 20 years, just finding ways to make it a little bit better.
I love it when I think of, big guitar tones, and I think of history and stuff. I can see Jimmy Page standing in Olympic with that, the Vox with the 4x12 and the Supra on the ground. And that's, the first place that I really know 2 amps.
Yeah.
We get into something like talking about what, they were accomplishing. And I know that Bob and Randy accomplished a ton, working together. And then Scott was there. He saw that, we see what turns into what I would consider, where my mentorship picks up with David, in the early 2000s with, the Diesel and the Naylor and these multi-mic setups and stuff like that. And, it's just really cool to start putting these pieces together. And it's really cool to, hear about it firsthand from someone who was out there in the trenches with these guys making records.
Yeah.
And, with that, when did you really start stepping out on your own? You've left Scott's, you're over at Tommy's. I'm assuming you're making the Methods of Mayhem records. I'm assuming that you're working on Tommy's solo stuff at this point. Is there a point when you became an independent producer or an independent engineer? How'd that go for you?
Yeah. So, when I was working at Tommy's place, I was still working on Tommy's projects. But I was also bringing in other things. I still did, I did another record so Scott kind of got out of the business pretty much, like he stopped producing and once he sold the chop shop. And so some of the clients that we had been doing records with, like Rob Zombie. I did a record with Rob Zombie after the Chop Shop was done. And obviously with Tommy, and I was kind of trying to kind of break off on my own a little bit and do things that were outside of that camp. And it's a little bit of a as anybody who's kind of come from, they're like, okay, I'm on this team and we're known for this, and then now you're out on your own. Sometimes that's not as quick and easy as a transition where everybody's like, oh, let's start hiring that guy. So I was doing a lot of stuff that nobody ever heard for a couple of years, mixed in with stuff that, a few things that of note. But that kind of serendipitously kind of aligned with when I reconnected with Chad Kruger. So I met Chad through Tommy when we were working on one of Tommy's records at the Chop Shop in like 2004, and kept in touch with Chad. And so I think it was about maybe a couple of years after I stopped working with Scott, and I'm still working at the Atrium, but not as much. We reconnected, and it was actually on a Avril Lavigne record. So he hired me to come and help finish an Avril Lavigne record. And then once that was done, he's like, we're going to go make a Nickelback record. And that was the first Nickelback record that I made with them.
So for this Avril Lavigne project, did you go back to Canada, or was that done in Los Angeles?
That was in LA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I was still in LA at the time. This is like 2009, maybe 2008, 2009, 2010. I can't remember, but in that kind of era. So Chad and Avril were in LA. They were deep in a record. It was like finishing lead vocals and some overdubs, a few new songs, stuff like that. And I actually ended up the very last song. The record was done, and Chad called me and he's like, we're over at the Sunset Marquee. He's like, can you come over we're gonna need you for a day or two. He's like, we're missing a kind of a skater boy-esque thing on this. Like the record was very pop and almost had almost some like kind of indie rock kind of stuff on it as well. And he's like, we're missing kind of like that kind of upbeat kind of pop punky kind of thing. And he's like, so we're gonna go over and try to write a song for this. And up until that point, I was mainly engineering for him and for that project. But even like when I worked with Scott, like sometimes the lines would blur. Like sometimes, I would be engineering and then Scott would step in and start EQing stuff instead of telling me what he want. And then sometimes I would be, we'd do a bunch of vocals and Scott would say, I would just start comping them, which is typically something a producer wants to do, right? So like the line had always kind of been a little bit blurry once you start kind of working in that type of relationship. So even on the Avril stuff, it's like I was at first, it was kind of like, okay, let's listen to all of this together, and okay, line 3, take that word, blah, blah, blah. And then by the end of it was like, okay, here's 10 takes, we're going for lunch, come back and the vocal would be done. So anyways, this last song, Chad came in, laid down a quick guitar idea, and he's like, we're not really kind of in a working mood. We'll be back in a couple hours, whatever. And I just started building a track to this guitar thing. He came down and he's like, holy shit, like we got a song here. Let's write, Avril, come down, let's write some vocals, some lyrics and whatever. So I ended up, that was kind of like my first quote unquote, production credit, even though I'd kind of been producing, but nothing of like, substantial note, was that last song on that Avril record. And I think that was kind of like, oh shit, like, okay, you can do other stuff too. And that may have been one of the things that Chad's like, hey, come make a Nickelback record with us. So like, we work well together. And I've been, we're in the beginning stages of my 4th record with them.
That's awesome.
So yeah, 15 years later.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, as we transition into this conversation, which I think a lot of people at home are interested in hearing about, tell us about what it's like to be responsible for the sound of Nickelback and what a lot of people look to when it comes to modern rock, these tones that you guys have pushed forward. I mean, how I make records, and there's genres out there that you have to pay attention to if you're making records. Like, I don't need to know what every bluegrass record sounds like, to be able to get through what I would consider my day.
Yeah.
But there are certain artists that I pay attention to when they release something new, just so I can stay current. If Dr. Dre releases a new record, I listen to it. If Eminem releases a new record, I listen to it. If Slipknot releases a new record, if Taylor Swift, if Nickelback releases a new record, I listen to it.
That's awesome.
So
never thought of it that way, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what's that like, man?
I mean, I think even before, I remember, like I said, I met Chad through Tommy in 2004. This is pre All the Right Reasons. So they were already big, but like, it just kept growing, right? And so I was a fan of Nickelback, when Silver Side Up. When that record came out, I was a fan of it. And so when I got to meet Chad, I'm like, I'm already a fan of Chad's. And like, so I don't want to say we just go and do what they've already done. Like, we try to evolve and we try to, do what's appropriate for the song and the time and the production and the whole thing. We kind of let that lead the sound. But the really cool thing about working with them is, like, I already knew what their records sounded like. They were already my favorite sounding records. So unlike some of the other artists that I was working with earlier, before we started, filming, I kind of said, like, there was a time period, probably around that time when I stopped working with Scott and before I started working with Nickelback, where I just wanted to make big arena rock records. Nobody wanted that. Like, they wanted kind of like the lo-fi stuff. I didn't like that. It was really hard for me to do any. I got hired on a project once to record drums, and I thought the drums sounded like the best drums I'd ever recorded, and everybody hated it. They're like, sounds too good, man. So when I started working with Nickelback, it was nice because it was kind of like, just do what I like. I already like that.
Yep.
And they already like that, right? So Randy Staub's, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you if Randy Staub didn't exist, So to then pick up from, records that he mixed, it's not like I'm like, oh God, how do I channel Randy Staub? I'm like, I couldn't unchannel it if I tried.
Absolutely. And people,
Not to say I'm anything close to that, but the influence is strong, and he made some of my favorite sounding records. And so even if I wanted to veer from that, there would be, I don't think I would get very far.
No, and it's not lost on me, and it shouldn't be lost on anybody at home that, you come from this lineage of great Canadian record makers that, includes people like Lenny and David. But then you think about the time that Randy and Scott spent in a room before you got there, developing what they thought sounded good.
Yeah.
And then they let you into their world. You were brought into it, molded by it. And that's, helped form and influence what you thought sounded good. So then, years later, when you end up on your own and you're dealing with clients that you're now interacting with who happen to be Canadian record makers, who have worked with other great Canadian record makers, who, happen to have an idea in their mind of what they think sounds good.
Yeah.
It's not lost that you could pick up, where they left off and then move it forward. And every time that I do listen to Nickelback, the one thing that I keep saying, I've said this to Ryan over the past couple of years, is like, it's nice listening to the new stuff that you guys are doing, because you guys are just getting fucking heavier.
Some of it.
Yeah, those dudes can shred, they can play, and it's.
Well, and they're fans of so many different kinds of music, but the thing. People have asked me before, not that I have all the answers by any means, but people have asked advice for, like, if you have career advice on how to be a successful producer or engineer. The thing that really, I'd say, took a turn for the better for me was when I started working, and it was not by design. It was all, I don't want to say all to chance, but it was, you got to get lucky and you got to have opportunities and then take those opportunities. But the biggest thing that I can really attribute to things taking a turn for the better for me career-wise, and also when I say career-wise, that's also like now I'm being more fulfilled. I'm having more fun. I'm happier and more excited to make records I'm also doing bigger records with bigger bands. Like all that stuff seems to kind of tie together. I don't know how many people you can separate that stuff out. But the thing that really made a big deal for me was finding clients that aligned. We had similar tastes. We had similar ideas of what sounds good. We liked, our influences had a lot of overlap. So when Chad says, "Hey, give me a heavy guitar sound," all I have to do, I don't have to guess what Chad wants. I do what I think sounds good. And oh, by the way, that's also what he happens to think sounds good. So we're good.
Yep.
And so it's so much more enjoyable, and I think it ultimately produces a better outcome when the thing that your client wants you to do and what they want, what they hear in your head aligns with what my natural tendencies and instinct is.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't always happen. I'll get a sound and then Chad will be like, play a little bit and like, yeah, it's too bright, or we need some more gain, more bottom end, or like, yeah, but we're in the ballpark.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of records early on, kind of in that window where, I make food analogies all the time. It's like, somebody wanted a pizza and I gave them a pepperoni mushroom bacon and they're like, "This is disgusting."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "What are you talking about? This is the tastiest pizza I've ever had." And they're like, "Oh no, like load that thing up with anchovies and black olives and extra onions." And I'm like, I won't touch that pizza.
Yeah.
So finding people who have have similar tastes, or at least the overlap, is enough to where it's like, I'm not guessing what somebody else wants. I'm not having to like, oh, am I doing this right? I'm like, if it sounds good to me, the people who have hired me, it sounds good. It's probably going to sound good to them. That was like, oh my God. And me and Chad, like if you went and looked, if Chad listed his top 20 favorite albums of all time, probably 15 would probably cross over with mine.
Okay.
And so it's not a mistake.
No,
when they had a big record, who mixed it?
Randy.
Yep. If I had all my favorite records, Randy mixed too. So it's like that again. Like we're getting deep in the weeds. We're not talking about the songs and the bands or whatever. We're talking about the mixer, the mastering engineer, the producers of his favorite records were the producers of my favorite records. Maybe it wasn't the same record, but the producers and the engineers were the same. Yep. Like there was just so much overlap. And I have a few other clients, the same thing. It's like we like the same sounds, we like the same music, we have the same influences. We're not the same. It's never going to be the exact same, but that overlap is what makes making records with those people. It's like, okay.
No, and I think that you made a great point that it really helps making records with people who like what you do.
Yeah. But it's crazy. It's crazy to think of how often, for a lot of people, and even I've heard this from like way more successful, bigger producers and engineers than myself, how many times they get hired to do something that they don't like.
Oh, absolutely.
It's probably happening right now in 50 studios.
Absolutely. And for me, I will say that, I like to be known as the person I'm the first person to fire myself,
I almost did the other day.
Yeah. If you come to me and I've got straight up requirements that I have for keeping you as a client. Yeah. If I turn in a mix and you come to me and you have notes about the sound of the lead vocal, kick drum, and snare drum, I will walk away from the mix.
Yeah, we're not right for each other.
We're not on the same page. We're if the first pass I didn't nail any of those sounds.
Yeah. We have different ideas
of what this song should sound like.
100%. Yeah. And you know what? That's a really great way to kind of. I've always thought about like how to have some sort of like objective metric for that. I think that's a really good way. It's like if you haven't nailed, maybe I'll do 2 out of the 3. If I haven't nailed 2 out of the 3 on the first pass,
well, it's actually 4 for me.
Okay.
The other 4th is the bass.
Interesting.
But for me, it's really like if there's notes about kick, snare, and lead vocal. Yeah. And like you can like typically people would be like, I love everything. Could we get the snare drum to be a little bit brighter or sit back a little bit more? Or I love everything, but the vocal, can we get it up a little bit? Totally. If you come back and you're like, you got a symposium about, the way that Culture Club records were made and the vibe of the effects that Roland was putting out in '86, you're like, Have a great day.
Here are your toys back. I'm going home.
Yeah.
You can take your ball. I'm going home.
Yeah. There's someone else on the internet who wants to send me a song that will have like a much better time than whatever you were intended to do here today, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that when you drive that point home, which, you know, you said is it really helps when the people that you're working with like what you do.
It seems so obvious.
I mean, that's the whole takeaway from today, you know, and I want to geek out and I want to nerd out and I want to ask all these questions that I know everybody wants me to ask, you know, but really that's the art of record making, you know. If you can be a good hang and you can do the things that people want you to do and you're expected to do, everything else that happens in between those moments is just life, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that being able to sit and have a conversation where really like no matter what we fucking talk about today, that's what I'm gonna walk away with, you know. I think that that's so important. But now that we have you here, they want to know, does the kick drum that you record make it to the mix in a Nickelback song?
I would say probably always, except there was a song, one in particular that we recorded recently, and it's probably not going to be the finished drum track anyways, but we had an SM91 on the inside of the mic, and it was up on like kind of like the pillow in there, and it fell. Ooh. And so it was up against the head. Yep. And so obviously I can't use that. I was using the outside mic and whatever, but it's always in there. Yeah. It might be tucked, but it's in there. It's in there.
That's my question. You're never completely getting rid of it and just
not unless there's something like I said, unless the mic's crapping out or it's hitting up. Like I'll always use start with that, and then start, and I'll get it to sound as good as I can get it. What I like to do. So what I used to do is I would take whatever mics I had, and I would be like, okay, my goal is to try to get this to where I don't need samples. Yep. And I never achieved my goal ever. Because the sound in my head is not a microphone on a fucking kick drum. It just doesn't exist. It's not there.
I've had that same problem for the past like 100 years. And don't get me wrong, there's sounds in my head that are just microphones on kick drums. Sure. They're not modern rock sounds. Like I can give you Dire Maker from Led Zeppelin. Like we can do that right now with a D12. Yes. We're not making a Nickelback record.
No. And so I know I need samples. So what I now do is I compartmentalize kicks and snares. So when I think of a kick drum, I think of like, okay, well, when I'm mixing, what are the different kind of quote unquote components of the kick drum that I need? If certain songs, I do want kind of some subby low end. Certain songs, I don't need that. I do need some attack. I do like kick drums and snare drums. I like drums to have sustain. I don't love, I love boo. So I'm going to need some sustain. All of these things. I need kind of what's the tonal kind of signature of the drum. Is it a ringy thing? Is it a splatty thing? Is it a gong gong, kind of like a doinky thing? Like what is it, right? So I kind of think of all of these different things, and I listen to the mics, and I'm like, based off of what the sound is, which component does this fill the need for? Because unless it's a terribly recorded drum, like it's going to fill one of those needs. It's not going to fill all of them, but it's going to fill one of them. So maybe it's like, you know what? The attack on this drum is really good. Yep. And so, you know what? I'm going to EQ this and use it for the attack, but now I got to fill in all the other blanks with samples. Or sometimes it's like, wow, this has got a really cool sustain. I just recently, talking about Tommy Lee, I did a session with him for the first time in years, and it was fucking awesome. And we had a drum that had some sustain on it. So boom, 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 right? And I was like, okay, cool, we got that. But now I need the like, right? We were lacking that. There was definitely some punch that was missing off the front end. So I kept the sustain of this, but I put a sample in that was short and gave that the front of that kick. Now the sustain almost sounds like a sample. You'd think the front end was the kick and the sustain was a sample, and it's actually the other way around. So I pick what component is the mic going to serve the best? And then I kind of like allocate it to that. And sometimes it's 2 or 3, and it's like, okay, now I got to fill in the sample with this. The thing with Nickelback is like, and I think everybody in their head, like, don't think of a specific Nickelback song, but come up with your own Nickelback song, and there's a kick drum and a snare sound that you're already playing in your head. And that's the one that I play in my head. I'm not doing that because I'm like, oh, we gotta use the same kind of sounds again. It would sound funny to me without it.
I'm assuming that when you got back from the hospital, they gave your parents a DAT tape and said, in 18 years, he'll know what to do with this thing.
Dear son, I don't know what this is, but they told me to give it to you.
The governor of Canada said that you'll need this.
Ironically enough, it's so funny because I think there's a couple samples that you can kind of hear in it. There's a few others, but it's amazing to me. Like if I was to open up 5 Nickelback mixes that I've done,
Yep.
the treatment and the balance is probably different on all of them. And trust me, I don't know why I know other mixers who make records like this. I've never been able to do this. I wish I could just import all my settings to the next song and be like, fuck, this mix is done. I have never had that. Not once, ever. To the point where I'm like, man, the kick and snare, we've nailed it. Like, this is as good as it gets. And then I've been poured it into the next song, and I'm like, this sounds terrible. Like, what is going on? And I mean, obviously, I know tempo, tuning, all the parts, the way everything. It's the sum of the parts as opposed to the parts. But at the end of the day, when you hear it, you're like, yeah, there's like a common thread. But when you break it apart, you're like, that's not the same. So it's very odd. Well, it's not odd. It makes total sense, actually. I hear the finished product in my head. And so whatever I'm going to do to get there, it's probably going to produce a similar result. Could I do a Nickelback song without? Absolutely. I would probably end up making another sample sound like.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And so how you get there, but the reason why is because it's like, yeah, it fills it checks all those boxes.
Okay. For the folks at home, I grabbed a 421 and an NS10, and I spent a whole week with Ryan recreating.
Did you get pretty close?
Fuck yeah.
I'm not surprised.
I want to give you our and see if it's good enough to end up in one of your songs, one of your productions. Like if you listen to it and you're like, oh, that's
I'm going to use it just because of that.
But it's interesting because those samples, they're not just, as you said, they're not just the sound of microphones. Like those samples have the sound of DATs and shit distorting when they were getting printed, baked into them.
Yes, yes.
And it's part of that sound.
Well, and EQs and all this stuff. And one of the things that I started doing a few years ago, I do it on all my projects now, is when I'm producing a song, when we're using programmed drums and we've got all this stuff, when we get to the point where we're recording live drums, I take wherever we're at with the program stuff, and I solo all the kicks, whatever's going on. If I might be firing 5 different samplers at the same time, whatever, I'm EQing it, compressing it, all that stuff. I'll solo all the kicks, and I'll print that. And then once I edit the drums, that will be the sample for that song.
Yep.
So I have all of these samples. I can't use them at the same time because there's too many similar components, and you get weird fucking phasing. But every song has its own sample based off of whatever it was once we got there.
Yeah.
And they're all a little bit different, but they're built of kind of similar components, and they end up almost in the same place, but they're different.
Yeah.
And so
that's why they help.
So my is probably not the same that everybody else has.
Oh, no. And I'm assuming, and that's the thing is nobody is the same. Like even the one that Bob put out in the sample pack that he did with Tune Tracks or whoever it was.
Is there one in there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, awesome.
Yeah.
All right, that's probably the most authentic. I got to go get that one.
Well, it's different than the one that I have from or the one that I have from or like all these ones that are floating out around all of these, I mean, all these fucking that are out there.
Yeah.
You hear that sample just everywhere. And I've pointed it out to people and everyone's like, it's not the same kick drum sample in every single song. It's like, it's blended in.
So good. It's so good. I mean, there's one other, there's a kick and a snare sample. I don't know if it's as prevalent today. There was a snare floating around for a long time. And I was like, I recognize that from somewhere, and I went, and I used to have an Alesis. What was the drum machine? DM4.
There's the DM4, but are you talking about the AR16?
It was a pad one, but it had the same sample bank as the rack mount one. Mm-hmm. And there was a snare that everybody was using. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's the same snare. And sure as shit, I've got a sample of it, and I pulled it up. I'm like, that's the Elisa's snare. Nobody knows that's from a fucking 1991 Elisa's 16-bit drum machine. But that was...
Well, those Elisa's samples,
they were awesome.
They're out there cracking. There's one right now that's pretty much the king of rock drums.
Really?
Yeah, Punchy Kick.
Punchy Kick.
Yeah.
Well, I think the Pantera, well, that wasn't actually a sample, but there was a Pantera kick drum, or a sample in the Elisa's DM4 that sounded exactly like the Pantera kick.
Yeah.
The only reason I know that the Pantera kick wasn't a sample is because I've seen those tracks, and I'm like, holy shit.
It wasn't a sample.
No.
I heard that it was like fucking quarters taped to the kick drum and shit.
I can kind of go along those lines. I have seen Vinnie Paul's Chad's got a kit of his.
Really?
Yeah, and I was actually looking at that. I was looking at the kick drum the other day, and there's some fucking cool shit going on with that thing.
So is there a credit card and quarters?
No, I don't think it was a quarter, but there was some really cool muffling stuff that I'd never seen anybody do before.
Like what? Tell us about it.
I can't. Cut the camera.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of the video, guys. Thank you so much.
Doesn't want to share anymore.
No, we've gotten to the point where we're just going to talk about shit that we can't put on the internet. So we're...
Everybody already knows. No. Dude, this is awesome.
Fuck yeah.
Buddy, great to see you.
Let's
Thanks
go
for
grab
coming
some
by.
lunch.
Let's do it.